This is why going within is so important. Centering prayer, meditation, and for people who need a tool, I can highly recommend differential frequency brainwave entrainment like sacred acoustics. But what you find is that all of us can start sensing guidance, angels, the various kind of spiritual aspects of our life that can serve us in navigating these lives in the material world, but doing it far more effectively and with result. So in other words, our lives are not some meaningless, purposeless, blind, mechanistic existence, but something that has purpose and meaning and direction, and also involves learning and teaching for self and others.
Welcome to the Angels and Awakening podcast, where we connect you with your angels, loved ones, and soul self. I'm your host and author, Julie Jancius. My journey began when I started hearing my late father before I knew he'd passed. Through my readings, membership, and Angel Reiki school, I help you awaken, heal, and master your unique spiritual gifts. If you feel called to work with me, it's your angels guiding you to discover your soul's highest purpose. Details at theangelmedium.com. Thank you, Earth Angels, for the 5-star reviews. You're entered into a drawing to win a free session. Now let's see what messages your angels have for you today. Hello, beautiful souls. Welcome back to the Angels and Awakening podcast. Friends, today we're here with worldwide expert on near-death experiences, Dr. Eben Alexander. He's written so many books that you can find on Amazon and small bookstores around the world. And if you subscribe to Psychology Today, like I do, and a number of magazines, you will often find him quoted as the worldwide near-death expert. Dr. Eben Alexander, we've had you on before, but welcome again, and thank you for taking time out of your day to be here.
Well, Julie, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on. It's great to be with you again.
So I was scrolling through social media one day, and I came upon a documentary, and something called me to just stop, watch the preview for this documentary. And I've noticed how there are times where the entertainment industry uses scariness, this ghosty energy to kind of make things maybe seem what they're not. And I don't want to put words into your mouth, but I don't think you weren't featured in this documentary, but they were featuring people who've had tons of near-death experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And there was this one part where people were talking about seeing this black nothingness and being scared in a near-death experience. And I literally heard in my intuition, get Eben Alexander on the podcast to talk about this so that we can kind of demystify this, because they were leading people to believe that there's a hell. And in 7,000 sessions that I've done, I haven't found anybody that's in hell. There's only the other side, which is heavenly. So I'm going to pass this over to you. And do you have any thoughts on this?
I have a lot of thoughts on this, and I'm so glad you're bringing it up because it's a very important topic. I've been studying near-death experiences intensively for the last 15 and a half years, ever since I had my own. I never paid any attention to them before because as a practicing academic neurosurgeon, I thought, well, brain creates consciousness. These are tricks of the dying brain. Who cares about NDEs? But what they're showing us is something much grander than that, that our kind of general model of, physical world is all that exists, that the brain creates consciousness, is false. It is absolutely untrue. And in fact, in many corners, science has rejected materialism or physicalism. That is the notion that, only the physical exists and therefore the brain must be conjuring consciousness up out of purely physical matter. But we know now that that is not true. We need a much bigger theater of operations. Now, the important thing is when you look at near-death experiences in large numbers, say, for example, from the perspective of Bruce Grayson, a very skeptical psychiatrist who's studied NDEs for more than 45 years now, you just can't deny all the evidence. And the evidence really leads towards a beautiful conception of heaven. And of course, the materialist or the atheist says, well, that's all wishful thinking. But no, not when you actually study the data and pay attention to it. And you find that the general theme of NDEs is absolutely one of love, compassion, kindness, mercy, of finding our spiritual home. And that's what it is. Now, in my own story, if I had started, the way my journey did start, as I often describe it, is in this place I call the earthworm's eye view, a very primitive, coarse kind of subterranean existence. If I had gone there, and then come back to this world, I would have had, a negative or kind of hellish NDE. But I think that's the problem, is they're incomplete. Of course, all NDEs are incomplete in some fashion because we don't then go on to die. But that's where it's so important to point out, for example, the work of Christopher Kerr, who wrote the book Death is But a Dream, I think about 5 or 6 years ago. And that book is all about hospice and terminal care, period. And he comes away with the same conclusions about what happens to those patients is the same kind of thing that happens to near-death experiencers, especially getting into elements of a life review, of having your life flash before your eyes. And I think that our concepts of hell really come from life reviews where people, might have handed out a lot more pain and suffering and shown more greed and selfishness. And when you're on the receiving end of that, which is exactly what happens in the life review, because it's from the perspective of all involved, not just your own perspective, but from everyone involved. And what you learn quickly is that we learn through life reviews, as the Armenian soldier proclaimed through Plato 2,400 years ago, that when you die, your life flashes before your eyes, and you find the only thing of any import is how much love you were able to bring into the world. That is the big, giant, dominant theme of NDEs, not this kind of fear-mongering, hell-mongering, all that. And the life review is not only perceived as reliving the events, not just remembering events, but reliving the events from the perspective of all souls involved. But also, it's really something about a third of people, according to Dr. Grayson's data, about a third of life reviews involve a complete reliving of one's life. And of course, we say, how can that happen, over just a few minutes of, say, a cardiac arrest? But the important thing is when we're in that realm, when we have that kind of exposure, and it's the same realm that we're exposed to in dreams and psychedelic experiences, et cetera. But in an NDE, you get this beautiful, broad, panoramic view of it, and you realize it's a spiritual home, and it seems very comforting. And that's where people need to remember that deep at the heart of the majority of these stories is really one of love and compassion and kindness and being in our spiritual home and growing and transforming and evolving as souls. In fact, I'd say we're contributing to the transformation of all consciousness through these experiences. But don't for 1 minute believe that, the horrible, fearful, judgmental God type Old Testament versions is what is happening, because in fact, it's much more of a very promising, loving, connecting, and transformational piece. And in fact, when you read this literature, the broad statement would be that only about 3 to 5% of near-death experiences are negative or hellish. But even when you read those, like Howard Storm's account, what you realize is that people come back positively transformed in the same kind of ways as they are with a very positive, affirming, heavenly, beautiful, all-loving NDE, because they come back realizing that God force is at the core of the universe, and that is a force of love. And the more we align with that force and choose to bring love and kindness and compassion into our lives, dealing not just with ourselves, but serving as a conduit to let that love out into the world at large, that is kind of the nature of the transformation that comes from NDEs. So I think people, when you study these things scientifically, you start to realize that it's a very promising, optimistic, harmonious view of the world, and it comes with a tremendous kind of spiritual growth and soul advancement as we open up our awareness to this sense of the one mind. I mean, essentially, what it's all pointing to is that we're sharing the one mind of the universe. And that's exactly what NDEs are, is a revelation of this incredible overlap of mental experience across space and time that we have when we're in the process of leaving our physical body. And that's what an NDE is this extraordinary connection with loved ones who might still be incarnate in planet Earth. For example, in Anita Morjani's NDE, how she witnesses her brother who is flying from India to Hong Kong because she's extremely ill and expected to die. So he's flying there, and she connects with his mind in a way that she knows what he's doing and thinking. Likewise, at the same time, she connects with the mind of her father, who's left the physical plane. And he's very comforting and reassures her that the reason she actually had her cancer was because of her fear of cancer. So fear itself can become a very kind of damaging construct if we don't understand the deeper basis of what's going on. And ultimately, I would say that the greatest gift my NDE gave me, and that includes the 15 and a half years of study with other scientists of other NDEs and similar experiences across the board to try and come to a bigger understanding of them, is really an idea of comfort, love, compassion, kindness, positive transformation, harmony. I mean, it's all the positives you can imagine. That's why, for example, going to the meeting of the International Association of Near-Death Studies, IANDS, and you can go to iands.org to learn more, but they have their meeting every Labor Day. I skipped it this year, but I've been many, many years in the last few, and certainly hope to go next year. But the reality is you find this incredible sense of optimism, love, compassion. I mean, these are all people who are kind of living with one deep and profound reality of connectedness, of being together. You know, there's a false sense of separation that comes from the materialist model that we're all separate beings, that our brain creates consciousness, existence is birth to death, nothing more. And that's extremely limiting. And it's a fiction, it's not real. For example, some of the greatest evidence that we deal with in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, that Karen Newell and I, she's my wife and partner in this work. We wrote that book back in 2017, Living in a Mindful Universe. But it is really all about how evidence from broad expanse of fields of science, quantum physics, neuroscience, the hard problem of consciousness, philosophy of mind, and what's known as the binding problem, the apparent unity of consciousness in an individual, which is very tough to explain from a materialist standpoint. If you think it's all just different neuronal populations contributing to this thing we call consciousness, well, why is consciousness so unified? And that's because it's unified from the get-go, because it's an eddy current from this primordial mind. And this is where you start to realize that the false sense of separation that comes packaged with materialism is extremely damaging. And it's also a bleak and paltry fiction about the nature of reality. So this is much more about the concept of the one mind, that God mind. And in my own journey, deep in my experience, you know, going from the earth from my view through this brilliant ultra real gateway valley, ascending through light portals and angelic choirs to the highest level, that core level, complete oneness with the divine, which I think is at the heart of all these spiritual journeys, you come back with tremendous sense of comfort and that we're all truly in this together. And the thing that connects us all is a binding force of love. It's not of threat and fear and, you know, all these kind of dark pieces that get injected by people who I think are only taking a very superficial look at some of the evidence in certain cases and not taking the deep dive. And the deep dive is where you start to realize that those shallow little superficial dives, especially the 3 to 5% that are negative NDEs, in many ways, they help to broaden out the entire picture. But what they're not doing is taking you away from the notion of love and the binding force of love that connects all of us in this world and in the spiritual world.
Here's our free and paid upcoming events. Angel Reiki School is in person November 8th through 10th in Chicagoland, or begin online November 1st. My new course, Release Fear and Embrace Miracles, starts November 1st online. Become a member to get this course free, or it's $133 for non-members. We have a free workshop October 23rd at 8 p.m. Central on how fear is really holding you back. And join our free prayer meeting right before that at 7 p.m. Central. Sign up for all of this and more at theangelmedium.com/events. So this perfect. And I know you answered this, but those people who are just going to keep repeating the same question, do you believe there is a hell?
No, there is, to me, it makes zero sense to have a hell, some eternal damnation for souls. And of course, when you get into religious literature, for example, Augustine thought that everything was predetermined. So the souls that were destined for hell were destined for hell no matter what. Well, I would say that's a very kind of bleak prospect and doesn't really open up to the reality of our free will and our ability to learn and teach these deep lessons to allow for transformation of the soul and evolution of all consciousness. That's the much bigger picture that I think emerges when you really pay attention to all of this gigantic story, not just of near-death experiences, but everything else we can say about conscious awareness. And the one thing that I was going to mention a minute ago and didn't really get into in detail, but that has to do with the reincarnation data. I never thought reincarnation was possible before. I didn't realize in my NDE, it was obvious that reincarnation had to be a huge part of the package. And it was only after I came back to this world in 2008 that I started doing research and found that, in fact, an academic institution that was only 65 miles north of me when I lived in Lynchburg, Virginia, University of Virginia, UVA, Division of Perceptual Studies, has more than 2,500 cases of past life memories in children that they've examined in the last 6 decades. And of those 2,500 cases, something like 1,700 cases are solved. That is, yes, they found the person who lived before described by the child. And in many of these cases, it's been proven beyond doubt that there was no way that the child just kind of acquired this knowledge through some nefarious mean, or that it was a scheme by the parents or what have you, all those kind of paranoid delusions that people have when they say this can't be real. The literature from Ian Stevenson and now under Jim Tucker is crystal clear. Reincarnation is part of human existence. Scientifically speaking, it's been proven beyond any reasonable doubt. And if you want to come up with some model of consciousness, of the brain-mind connection, understanding of the nature of reality, it must absolutely incorporate and embrace the idea that our souls come back again and again into different bodies and different lives, even though we may come back with our soul group and kind of reshuffle the various roles we play, the lessons, the teaching and learning that we haven't, are planning to kind of encounter in that lifetime. But the reality is we must explain this thing of our souls having a big basis in reality that involves coming back in other lifetimes. And that data, for example, does not support that this is a hereditary kind of DNA-based memory from one generation to the next, because 80% of those cases studied at UVA are not in the same family. So they come back in different families. It's amazing how it's often nearby geographically, something kind of familiar and not the other side of the world. But there are plenty of cases where, we have geographical expansion. For example, there's that beautiful case that was vetted by Jim Tucker, who's the head at UVA, the case written about by Bruce and Andrea Leininger about their son, James Leininger. And turns out he was a reincarnated World War II fighter pilot who died in the Battle of Iwo Jima in the Pacific Theater of World War II back in March of 1945, and then was reborn in 1998, 53 years later, as a young child in Louisiana, who was having nightmares of being in a plane that was shot down by the Japanese, crashed flaming into the sea. And if you read the book is called Soul Survivor. I highly recommend it. You'll realize there are so many connection points that you really cannot just explain it all away as happenstance. There's far, far, far too much to the story. And that's what often happens in these cases, is there's a lot of information. In fact, to me, one of the most astonishing features in Ian Stevenson's earlier work at UVA was that something like 1/3 of these children actually had a birth defect or some deformity or birthmark at least that corresponded to the lethal wound of their prior lifetime. Absolutely astonishing. And it just tells us, don't think you've got some big understanding of the way the world works until you really start addressing all the data. And that's where I think some kind of militant atheist materialist scientists really get it wrong, because they actively debunk and deny and reject the data. Now, if you want to get to truth as a scientist, the last thing in the world you want to be doing is pushing data away that is trying to lead you in the right direction. And yet that's exactly what these people are doing. And I know how Jessica Utz, the head of the American Statistical Association, gave her presidential address in 2015, where she talked about her work on top secret projects that involved precognition, that is the ability of humans to know the future at least a few seconds in advance, and also remote viewing, the ability to discern information at a distance, like psychic spies. But the favorite example I have of remote viewing, for example, is Ingo Swann, who was a remote viewer with the US intelligence back in the 70s and 80s. And he was able to remote view the blue ring of Jupiter 6 years before the Voyager spacecraft went by and confirmed that Jupiter had a blue ring. And that's an example of remote viewing being a very successful illumination of facts that were unknown at the time. So her presidential address talked about those remote viewing and precognition as being proven beyond any statistical or scientific doubt. And yet people deny it. And it's because of the implications of spirituality, of God, of a soul. These implications are so big and they're such kind of battle points for our culture that you have these militant atheists who rise up and recoil and say, it can't be true. This is in fact, I know of militant atheists who have said, even if this were true, I wouldn't believe it. I mean, that's basically
Wow.
what they admit to. And yet the reality is it is true when you start examining more and more cases, all the evidence. And this is why, to have any kind of claim about this, you really need to do some deep study. And luckily for your readers, a lot of that scientific evidence has been collected. You go to bigelowinstitute.org. You will find 29 essays that were written in 2021 in a contest hosted by Robert Bigelow. He's an aerospace engineer out in Las Vegas. He had lost his wife. His son had committed suicide. He had serious questions. Are their souls really there? I mean, what does the scientific world say about the afterlife? And he put that question out there to the scientific community and said, what's the best scientific evidence for continuation of conscious awareness after permanent bodily death? And he was going to give out 3 monetary awards. They made a stipulation that you had to demonstrate at least 5 years of rigorous scientific research experience in the afterlife question. And in that setting, they received 204 essays. And of those, he ended up giving out 29 monetary awards. And all 29 of those essays are available for your readers right now for free at bigelowinstitute.org. I would highly recommend Jeffrey Mishlov's First Place essay. It's a mind bender, and it really takes a tremendous amount of information compressed into a 25,000 word essay limit and delivers on a big package of the reality of the afterlife. But it turns out there are other essays, and they're written from every different perspective. Some are deeply, deeply scientific. For example, Bernardo Kastrup's essay, Dean Radin's essay, Julie Beichel's essay on mediumship from Windbridge.org. There are many other scientific essays. Pim Van Lommel, who won second place. And I love how at the end of his essay, he actually refers to this one mind hypothesis that I've already talked about, that we're sharing that one mind, and the brain is a transceiver or filter that allows an eddy current of that one mind to appear in us. And at the end of Pim Van Lommel's essay, he reveals 4 sources, scientific sources, that he thinks are the best sources for the one mind hypothesis. The book, The One Mind by Larry Dossey, which I agree is an incredibly powerful and useful resource. A book, Spiritual Science by Steve Taylor, highly recommended. He also mentions our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, and then an essay by Bernardo Kastrup in, I think it's Journal of Consciousness Studies 2018. And that essay is called The Universe in Consciousness. I would also highly recommend, in addition to those 4 sources mentioned by Pim Van Lommel for the one mind hypothesis, his book, Consciousness Beyond Life, which is an incredibly good, erudite, scientific analysis of the reality of the afterlife from the perspective of a Dutch cardiologist who wrote a landmark paper in the highly esteemed journal Lancet back in 2001 about over 300 cardiac arrest patients in the Netherlands, where he found an 18% incidence of near-death experiences. So just a tremendous amount of literature. The Bigelow Institute essays are very important because no longer can any atheist scientist claim that this is all woo-woo nonsense, because all they're really doing is telling you they've been either too lazy or disinterested to read those Bigelow Institute essays. But once you start getting into them, there's no question. There's a lot going on here with the concept of the afterlife, which we have to explain.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for taking time to lay out all of that for us. I've written down those names and we'll research it so that we can put links in the show notes below. You had touched on one point that I want to go deeper into, which is angels and levels of angels. And you're around all the scientists who have studied all of this. You have studied all of this yourself. You have the research. What does the research say about angels? How many people see angels in near-death experiences? What were those levels of angels? Were they the typical choir of angels that we hear about that you raised up through? I want to hear about all of it.
Well, I think important to point out angels and spirit guides are certainly a key component of these kinds of descriptions and journeys. And I know in my own experience, as people who've read my book, Proof of Heaven, will realize, I had a guardian angel on this NDE who was absolutely critical to my understanding. And it was only by discovering her identity 4 months after my coma and realizing that I had a deep connection with her going way back in my life. And that has to do with the part of my story, the adoption abandonment wound. Because I was adopted. I was put up for adoption, left behind by my mother at age 11 days, although she wouldn't sign the papers to let me go. So until I was 4 months old. So I was stuck in a baby dorm. And that's a huge part of my story, was that adoption abandonment wound, because I'd spent my life with this kind of question of a subliminal, subconscious question in my mind as to whether or not I was even worthy of love. I mean, if my own birth mother left me behind, what often happens in that circumstance is an animal or a human will end up going into a hunger strike. If they're not held and nourished by their mother, they end up going into a pattern of existence that without support, they can go on and die. And so it's a very strong kind of psychic challenge to be abandoned by the mother at that age. And that's something I kind of struggle with my whole life. A year before my coma is when I finally met my birth family. I was 54 years old. All of that is written about in Proof of Heaven. I've talked about it many, many a time. But it was the identity of that guardian angel on the butterfly wing that was so critical. And it was only through a much deeper connection with my birth family that I was able to reveal her identity. And that's what is so important to me. And of course, in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, I talk more about how my father, my adoptive father, the neurosurgeon, who was so influential in my life, he had passed over 4 years before my coma, and yet he was nowhere to be found in my NDE. To me, that was a shocker, almost a deal killer. I mean, I cannot tell you the kind of psychological ups and downs I had around that he wasn't there. And yet in a vision during a meditation about a little over 2 years after my coma, when I was starting to meditate very heavily using binaural beat brainwave entrainment. For people who want a source for that, I would recommend go to sacredacoustics.com. That's the website of my partner, Karen Newell, my wife, who is also the co-author of Living in a Mindful Universe. But you'll find techniques that are very powerful for getting into a deep meditative state. And that's what I was doing at that time, a little over 2 years post-coma. And that's when I encountered the soul of my father. And he has become a guardian angel for me too. In many ways, I appealed to kind of his role and my that beautiful guardian angel from my NDE. Many a time in my deep meditations, I meditate an hour or two a day. I wouldn't trade it for anything. I've been doing that for more than 11 or 12 years now. And meditation is a great way for us to explore that primordial mind and, start meeting angels and guides and start getting much more in touch with our kind of spiritual self, and the spiritual universe that we're all part of. And this is why going within is so important. Centering prayer, meditation, and for people who need a tool, I can highly recommend differential frequency brainwave entrainment like sacred acoustics. But what you find is that all of us can start sensing guidance, angels, the various kind of spiritual aspects of our life that can serve us in navigating these lives in the material world, but doing it far more effectively and with result. So in other words, our lives are not some meaningless, purposeless, blind, mechanistic existence, but something that has purpose and meaning and direction, and also involves learning and teaching for self and others. So going within is very important, especially as you realize that the modern scientific view of the brain-mind connection is one that really dwells heavily on this notion of the primordial mind that we're all sharing, that God mind. And this is something we can all learn much more about through meditation, through opening our minds to that connection with the world at large. And it's why I recommend meditation so heavily, because I know in our workshops, it's quite common for people to come into connection with their own spiritual guides and angels and departed loved ones and other entities that can be very useful, instructional in these kind of journeys. So my advice to people, you don't have to, have a deep NDE to know everything I know about this. If you spend time meditating, especially if you can devote, 20 minutes or more a day to meditation, to going within mind and to quieting the ego mind, that's the important thing. You're not meditating if your little monkey mind voice in your head is still yapping away there. I love how in his book, The Untethered Soul, Michael Singer calls that voice in your head your annoying roommate. Your consciousness is your awareness of that voice, and that awareness is a much deeper mystery. And that's the part that does not end with bodily death. In fact, it's liberated from the shackles of the prison of the brain and body into a far grander existence. And that's what NDEs have been telling us for thousands of years across all cultures and civilizations and what have you. Time for people to start meditating, start learning more about the literature, go to that bigelowinstitute.org set of essays, learn more and more and more, read about experiences. You'll start seeing the possibilities. You expand your belief system tremendously. You find that one of our greatest problems in our modern society is that our commonly accepted societal beliefs are falsely limiting compared to what is really possible.
Do we share that one mind with our angels? If so, how does that work?
Well, I would say we all exist within consciousness, just as Bernardo pointed out in that beautiful essay in the Journal of Consciousness Studies back in 2018, the universe exists within consciousness. So the best way to look at all this is to acknowledge that all this physical world around us is really a model within mind, and that mind has a tremendous influence on how that model emerges. And I have found that the deep truth of this, and certainly as a healer, as a doctor, where I see all of this as having a very practical import, is in healing, in coming into wholeness. And what you find is something like placebo effect, which is much more than just a sugar pill fixing a headache. But placebo effect has been honored by medical science for more than 7 decades now, and is often used as kind of the gold standard when you're comparing different treatment modalities. You have a placebo arm, and that reflects medicine's observation that a patient's beliefs and attitudes can play a tremendous role in healing. And in fact, what you start to wonder how much effect some of these procedures and drugs actually have when you start recognizing how powerful one's belief in an ability of something to heal them can end up working if that belief is really strong.
Yeah.
And then you go beyond just placebo effect to, for example, spontaneous remission. So if you go to noetics.org, the Institute of Noetic Sciences website, put in the search term spontaneous remission, you'll find a book they wrote in the mid-1990s with more than 3,500 cases of healing of advanced cancer, advanced infection, et cetera, beyond any effect of medical intervention in these 3,500 plus cases. In fact, there were 1,000 cancer cases, and where They tried medical therapy and failed. And then here they end up using other modalities of, prayers, of spiritual basis in life, kind of taking responsibility for their life choices, et cetera. And there's actually a book, Radical Remission, that was written on 1,000 plus of those cancer cases by, I think it's Kelly Turner. I could be wrong on that, but Radical Remission is the name of the book, highly recommended. But she identifies 6 of the 9 factors that went beyond medical intervention to help those people heal. And they were mainly, and 6 of the 9 were really what we would call spiritual factors. It's just important for us to recognize the power of mind over matter. And of course, placebo effect, spontaneous remission, but then the highest level, in my view, are these cases of miraculous healing in near-death experiences. For example, my case, there's a medical case report on my medical records. It's in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, September 2018, by Dr. Serbi Khanna, Lauren Moore, and Bruce Grayson. And that case report makes it very clear my brain was far too ill to be harboring any kind of dream or hallucination. That's the part that really got my attention early on, was the more I studied my medical records, I realized that brain was not hallucinating and dreaming this stuff that I had witnessed, these incredible, ultra real and detailed memories that are as sharp today as if the whole thing happened yesterday. And so this is very important to realize. The brain is not creating consciousness. And that's what these profound NDEs can show you. And in fact, in that case report, the peer-reviewed scientific editors of the journal challenged the authors of my case report, who were not involved in my care, but fascinated by my recovery, and said, how do you explain his recovery? It's unprecedented in the medical literature to be that sick from a gram-negative bacterial meningoencephalitis, E. coli, then end up spending a week in coma and then having a full recovery. How do you explain this miraculous result? And they said, it's because he had a near-death experience. And the scientific review editors said, yep, that sounds like a good explanation to us, which shows you the scientific world is waking up to the much grander possibilities by not simply rejecting and denying and debunking the data, but accepting it and trying to explain it. And they knew of other cases like Anita Morjani, who wrote the book Dying to Be Me, and she had an advanced lymphoma, was in deep coma, and with her profound spiritual experience, her cancer disappeared. Or Dr. Mary C. Neal, the orthopedic surgeon who had a kayaking accident in Chile in the late 1990s. Her kayak was forced underwater, broke her legs under boulders, deep underwater, under a waterfall. She was down there more than 30 minutes in a warm water drowning, was finally pulled to the surface by her colleagues, dead. And they resuscitated her. She ended up having a full recovery, going back to orthopedic surgery and going around the world talking about her NDE like I've done and Anita Morjani has done. And there are many other cases out there like that. If you study the NDE literature, you'll find a lot of cases of people coming back with these recoveries that seem to defy all medical expectation. And the big lesson to all of us is this means it's time to start learning more about the power of belief and the power of our spiritual self and of our soul to influence our unfolding reality.
Friends, I just want to thank you for sharing each episode with your friends. Because of you, we've hit nearly 10 million downloads a year. Wow. As a thank you and gift, please enjoy my free 31-day angel success formula at theangelmedium.com so you can start connecting with your angels today. And please share today's episode if you've enjoyed it and tag me at Angel Podcast. Okay, so when you were talking about miracles, you mentioned a book, Kelly, but I had this vision of, and I heard internally, miracles and that state of belief is itself a different dimension. Like love is a different dimension. There's that part in Interstellar where they talk about how there isn't any social utility to love, but we love people who have passed away. What's the social utility in that? It's a different dimension. Love crosses time and space.
What I would say is that love is the binding force. I mean, it's not like a different dimension. It's what integrates everything throughout all dimensions. And there certainly can be higher dimensional space as part of the explanation of this. In fact, Bernard Carr, who is a physicist in England, he actually did his postdoc work under Stephen Hawking, and many people know Hawking, so you got to realize Bernard Carr is a very advanced physicist. And he's working on higher dimensional models, both spatial and temporal dimensions, to explain NDEs and that kind of thing. And I think Bernard Carr's work is very much kind of on target for this. A lot of what we witness may not just be from a distance in space and time in our four-dimensional space-time, but from other higher dimensions of space and time. And that's a big reality to wake up to. I mean, certainly physicists are okay with that. String theory necessitates, something like 10 extra dimensions to accommodate everything. They're what are called compactified. That is, they're not visible from this level, and yet they're very important in reality. And that kind of thing is part of Bernard Carr's work, higher dimensional space. But love is the universal glue. It's what connects all of this, connects us with that primordial mind of the universe, with a co-creative force, that God force that so many have encountered in near-death experiences. And like for me, and I know many others have used similar language, but in the core realm, in the deepest level of my journey, where all dualities were resolved, where, for example, dark, light, good, evil, masculine, feminine, etc., every bit of it comes into oneness in that core realm. That's where I recognized that my very conscious awareness was directly sourced in that God force of pure knowing. And it turns out that this God force and this thing we call consciousness is in the process of evolving. There's a reason why it's not all predetermined, and that there's a reason why these spiritual journeys can be instructive. And the more we learn about this, the more we contribute to the knowledge of consciousness about itself and about the nature of reality. In fact, early on after my coma, I read Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, his mid-20th century book, The Phenomenon of Man, where it became crystal clear to me that's kind of what I was seeking, was the vision he had. His vision as a French Jesuit priest, paleontologist. So he had a rich spiritual awareness as a Jesuit priest. He also had a very deep scientific training in the form of paleontology, a billion-year timescale look at the Earth and its history. And that's where he realized that in the mid-20th century, with all the debates about Darwinian selection and evolution, he realized evolution was real, but it was much, much bigger than just Darwinian evolution in biological systems on Earth. And he realized that all of consciousness throughout the cosmos was evolving. And I think that is really kind of where this is headed. That's the reason we are all here. We all contribute to that knowledge of consciousness and this deeper understanding. And that's why the spiritual awareness is so important, because we're spiritual beings in a spiritual universe. To try and deny that is really kind of taking us to the very most superficial kind of paint level of reality, as opposed to all the deep structure of it, which is where we can go when we start accepting many of these human stories that tell us a much bigger version of reality. That includes all the reincarnation stories, the near-death experience, all the hospice community, also appeals, for example, to the world of psychedelic studies, entheogens, which I recommend meditation as a far better way for getting to spiritual truth than psychedelics. But I think for some people, psychedelics kind of open the door a crack. And the interesting thing is the psychedelics, it's important that they're being researched again, because one of the biggest revelations from the scientific study of things like LSD, DMT, psilocybin, magic mushrooms, et cetera, is that your brain is not creating that phenomenal experience by doing something. The brain is actually getting out of the way. And there have been many papers that have shown that with functional MRI, magnetoencephalography, the big tools we have to really look at the brain in depth and its activity, you realize that people under the influence of those substances, the brain is going dark. There's no part of the brain that's increasing in its activity. In fact, the default mode network, which is probably the best defined network for, a daydreaming ego self, dissolves under the influence of these substances. So that's one important lesson, is that if you're expecting to use the tools of neuroscience to figure out how all that happens in somebody on psilocybin, for example, forget about it, because the brain is simply getting out of the way to allow the spiritual world to do all that. So you have to dig much deeper to get the answers. The other important thing I would say about psychedelics in this conversation is I point out the work of Roland Griffiths. Sadly, he passed from this world last October, but he worked at Johns Hopkins. He is really the father of the modern psychedelic movement. He's the one who really got it going again after the war on drugs back in the 70s with Nixon, et cetera. We finally got outside of that madness and have now re-allowed a study of psychedelics because they show us a lot about the nature of brain, mind, reality, et cetera. But the interesting thing about Roland Griffith's work is in looking at addictions, especially terrifically horrible addictions, nicotine, opiates, alcoholism, et cetera, he found that a single dose of psilocybin in the proper therapeutic setting gave a positive beneficial effect against those addictions in 80% of a pilot study, in those 80% of those patients over a year later. So one dose. It's not like you keep taking or microdosing the psilocybin. It's one dose in a proper therapeutic setting. And I would say that it's connecting with your higher soul, with that primordial mind, that higher part of yourself that's far above and beyond the ego voice, that little rattling voice in your head that is such an annoyance that you can get, put into timeout through meditation techniques like with sacred acoustics. But what I think Griffiths was showing was the power of this kind of higher soul to guide you in the right direction and bring you into healing. And that's what I would say we can all accomplish with meditation. As I've mentioned, the psychedelics can be revealing to some people about their spiritual nature, but it's not like you have to keep taking the medicine. You take it once, and that does all the good in the world. That's based on Roland Griffiths' very fine work. I would like to do a study actually comparing sacred acoustics head to head with a single dose of psilocybin for those addictions. And also note that Roland Griffiths had another study in patients with a debilitating fear of death in cancer patients. And one dose of psilocybin, same thing. A year later, 80% of people still had a tremendous positive benefit from the experience. And it was amazing how little kind of actual assistance they had during the experience. It was just a positive environment that allowed somebody to just sit with their experience, with their higher soul, learn the lessons that they were going to learn by getting their ego out of the way. Remember that ego is right at the heart of all those addictions, that fear of death, et cetera. Is that little crazy ego mind. It's not your ally in these journeys. So in meditation and centering prayer, the goal is to allow that little ego voice to state a request, make an intention, but then it goes into timeout. And I've learned to just ride those waves of music in the sacred acoustics. If you go to sacredacoustics.com, you'll find exactly what I'm talking about. And I would like to mention, just in support of all that, that there is a pilot study by Dr. Anna Newsom, a New York City psychiatrist. She wrote a beautiful book called Fulfilled on spiritual psychiatry. I highly recommend her book. But in this context, she wrote a scientific paper where she looked at the effect of sacred acoustics, specifically a set of files called the Whole Mind Bundle, which Karen Newell has made available to the world ever since the beginning of the pandemic at a discounted price. In fact, I think it's still available for free to anyone with financial hardship due to the pandemic, et cetera. And she did that because this study that was published in February of 2020 by Dr. Anna Newsom showed a 26% reduction in anxiety symptoms over 2 weeks. And that's compared to only 7% reduction in the control group that got standard talk psychotherapy for their anxiety over 2 weeks. So just listening to sacred acoustics tones over 2 weeks gave you a 26% reduction in anxiety. And I promise you, there's far more going on here than just reducing anxiety. But the kind of effects we see in our workshops with sacred acoustics are people connecting with souls of departed loved ones, coming in touch with their spirit guides, et cetera, et cetera. Much bigger field of operation once you acknowledge the reality of the spiritual realm and of our existence as spiritual beings, and how we can start to cultivate and enhance those effects through intentional meditation, where we put in intention and attention to achieve certain goals in our life.
Has there ever been a study done on those who are open to the other side? For me, there's a vibration of oneness with all things. I can feel things very palpably. I feel this openness in my crown. I don't feel like I'm in my body anymore. I feel like my body is just one with all that is, and all that is one with me. Has there ever been a study that those of us who are in that vibration, when we work with other people, we can open something within them like it sounds like the acoustics does as well, to bring them back into that vibration themselves.
Well, I think you find a lot of evidence of that kind of connection the more you read these kinds of experiences. And you have to really open your mind to all kinds of experiences. For example,
Mhm.
before my coma, I probably wouldn't have paid too much attention to Windbridge.org. That's Julie Beichel's scientific site on the study of psychic mediums. And yet you find that when you become aware of that information, of how psychic mediums are able to connect the dots to actually get a reading from a soul where they might only have the first name as a piece of evidence to work with. And yet, in Julie Beichel's quintuply blinded protocols, and she also has that very good BigelowInstitute.org essay. But what you find is the different ways of communication that involve, say, a three-way, where you've got the psychic medium as an interface between the sitter, that's the person who's lost the loved one, and the soul of the departed loved one. And I think as you study and find the different ways that those connections reveal, and this is something that you can see, for example, in a good psychic medium, one who truly has skill. There's some out there who are unfortunately don't know what they're doing and are not good at it, but that's not to detract from the fact that I know Windbridge has identified at least 20, probably quite a bit more by now, of psychic mediums around the world who do, like a 76% hit rate. I think that was quoted in one of Julie's papers. But you start to find in looking at these larger systems of study involving, the spiritual world, the psychic medium as an intermediary, the sitter, et cetera, you start to find the dynamics of how people can help other people get spiritual assistance and guidance in these kind of journeys. So I think that kind of gets at an answer to your question. I think if you read those BigelowInstitute.org essays, you'll also find a lot of evidence for the kind of thing you're talking about this kind of cooperation between members of a soul group that contributes to much greater kind of growth and understanding.
I think that it's hard for some people who are just getting into this to really understand, but I'm wondering if you have any research behind this. What's the difference in a person's life experience between people who meditate and connect with their angels, live in that oneness and that love vibration, maybe not 24/7, but regularly and consistently throughout their life. And those who may believe, but they don't spend any time connecting with the other side. They don't spend any time in meditation or working with their loved ones or angels on the other side. What's the difference in those two life
Well,
experiences?
I think you can actually find your answer when you research deeply into the whole broad population of near-death experiencers, because near-death experiences are so kind of surprising and unexpected to a lot of people in our society. Oh my God, you thought you were dying and all of a sudden you're more alive than you've ever been. How do you explain that? And it's kind of shocking. So some of them tend to kind of shy away from it, especially if they have very hardcore materialist worldviews in advance. It's very challenging for them to reject that. And yet they've had a personal experience, which is undeniable. And so you find this whole spectrum of people in the near death experience community, and the research arm of that, or one of them, I would recommend IANDS.org. International Association of Near Death Studies, and you'll find thousands and thousands of reports of NDEs and of similar experiences in that database, and plus a lot of knowledge offered up from that website about the scientific study of these phenomena that'll help you on your journey. But I think you find that especially there's been a shift, kind of to answer your question, with more and more people accepting this and realizing, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of momentum building. And I can promise you in the last 10 years or so, there's been tremendous growth in the scientific study of NDEs and of consciousness in general. In fact, I know when Karen and I were at a meeting in Belgium, there was a neuroscientific group from Liège, and one of their presenters put up a slide that showed a fourfold increase in the annual number of scientific papers on near-death experiences beginning in around 2012, 2013. And they
Mhm.
attributed that fourfold increase in scientific papers on this topic to the publication of the book Proof of Heaven. Now, I'm not sure I can claim that kind of, maybe it was just good timing. But the reality is there has been a tremendous kind of increase in scientific interest and belief, acceptance in the reality of these phenomena. And for those who are deeply, richly scientific and demand the ultimate highest in science, I would say, well, you can read our book, Living in a Mindful Universe. That's a very good point. And that was written mainly for the general public. But for the hardcore scientific minds, what I would tell you is go to Ed Kelly's book. Ed Kelly is at University of Virginia, and he's written 3 books over the last few decades that I think are landmarks in this world and in this field of research. Irreducible Mind in 2008, then Beyond Physicalism in 2015, and in 2021, he came out with Consciousness Unbound. They're 3 tough reads. They're big, thick. They make excellent doorstops when you've read them, but they're incredibly good works that show the scientific power of learning about this, not just kind of from your armchair saying, well, I don't believe any of this can be real, so I say it's all bunk. Well, guess what? Start doing your homework and you realize there's a tremendous amount of fascinating reality to this kind of spiritual research. And I would highly recommend people can get this education starting with those bigelowinstitute.org essays. But if you absolutely demand the highest level of kind of scientific rigor, I would go for Ed Kelly's books.
Yeah.
But you've got to devote months and months of your life because they are absolutely dense and filled with a tremendous amount of information to support their conclusions.
Amazing, amazing, amazing. I don't know if you can answer this in a minute, but why is there a need for different levels of angels, in your opinion?
Well, I think it really has to do with our levels of growth, and we need assistance because to be at a very kind of low level of knowledge about all this and trying to make progress is a very different position from having had personal experience, decades of hours a day meditation, et cetera. And so we're all at different points on the scale. And so are kind of the elements of guidance available to us in the spiritual realm. So it just shows you that the universe responds to us at the level that we're at. I learned early on after my near-death experience that I should not expect anybody to meet me where I was, but that I really had to meet people where they were. And in many ways, the universe does exactly that by providing the spiritual guidance. There's that old saying, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. And I think you find that very commonly in this kind of system, especially where people are open to mental exploration through centering prayer and deep meditation, including meditation greatly enhanced with sacred acoustics and other forms of binaural beat brainwave entrainment. But what it means is the universe is our friend in opening up to us and helping to bring us along, to this pathway towards greater realization of our sense of meaning and purpose in the universe, and in really accomplishing an evolution of soul and the transformation and evolution of all of consciousness throughout the cosmos.
Unbelievable. Dr. Eben Alexander, your books are just amazing. You are amazing. Thank you so much for all the work that you do in this world. Please share with everybody where they can find you.
Well, Julie, thanks for having me on and thanks for getting this out there. You can go to Eben, EBEN, Alexander.com. Highly recommend the FAQ page there, the recommended reading list that has a lot of hot links to scientific papers. It's all categorized, et cetera. There are also many interviews, conferences, videos, audios, et cetera, listed at ebenalexander.com. Also, don't miss sacredacoustics.com to learn more about meditation. And of course, there's another site, innersanctumcenter.com, INNER, sanctumcenter.com, has multiple resources available. One of them is a set of more than 50 interviews that we did, Karen and I did, with other thought leaders around the world in consciousness, other experiencers, et cetera. All 50 plus interviews available for free at innersanctumcenter.com. There is a mental health practitioner course that we did with Dr. Anna Usum. That's available at a cost for professionals, but that's also available. It's an excellent course on kind of spiritual psychiatry, spiritual psychology, what have you. And also there's a monthly webinar we do with some of our biggest fans, all available at innersanctumcenter.com. So I highly recommend people visit that site ebenalexander.com, sacredacoustics.com, and many of the other sites we've mentioned here today.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, Julie, thanks for having me. It's great being with you again. And until next time, namaste.
Namaste. If you feel called to become a certified angel messenger, energy healer, and medium, join my Angel Reiki school to learn all three at once. I'll also give you my secret sauce for building a successful, sustainable spiritual business. We're in person November 2024 and April 2025, or start the Angel Reiki school online on the first of the month. For personal messages from your spirit team, book a one-on-one reading with me. New slots are released monthly via email. Join my membership to grow spiritually, heal deeply, and connect with your angels for daily guidance and support on your personal journey. Visit theangelmedium.com/contact. Have an angel story? Share it at theangelmedium.com/contact to inspire our community with hope and love. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you back here Monday with a brand new episode.